There is a specific coordinate in the South Atlantic where the map simply stops. It is a place of infinite blue, where the depth of the water is measured in miles and the silence is measured in eternity. They say that the human body can survive 3 minutes without air, 3 days without water, and 3 weeks without food. These are the rules of biology. They are the limits of our machine. But in 1942, one man broke the machine. His name was Poon. He was not a soldier. He was not an explorer. He was a steward, a man trained to pour tea and fold napkins. And yet, when his ship was erased from the surface of the earth in less than 2 minutes, he did not die, he drifted. For 133 days, it is a number that shouldn't exist. It defies medicine. It defies logic. To survive that long alone on a wooden raft the size of a door requires more than just luck. It requires a descent into a kind of madness that few of us will ever understand. It requires a man to stop being human and start being something else entirely. Tonight, we are not just telling a war story, we are looking into the abyss of human endurance. We are going to examine the day-by-day arithmetic of keeping a soul attached to a body when the entire world wants to separate them. So, lock your doors, pour yourself a glass of water, and appreciate it. Join me as we drift into the dark. To understand the scale of what happened, you have to look at a map of the South Atlantic. And you have to look at it not as a shipping lane or a grid of coordinates, but as a desert. A liquid desert, moving and breathing, stretching for thousands of miles in every direction. If you place your finger on the map 750 miles east of the Amazon River Delta, and you push down, you are touching one of the loneliest places on the face of the earth. In 1942, this was the blind spot of the world. It was a place where radio signals faded into static, a place where the curvature of the earth hid ships from one another, and where the sky met the water in a perfect, unbroken, terrifying circle. To be here was to be nowhere. On the morning of November 23rd, the British merchant ship SS Benlomond was cutting through this emptiness. She was a slow beast, heavy in the water, steaming alone from Cape Town to Paramaribo. She was unarmed, unescorted, and tired. The iron of her hull was vibrating with the rhythm of the engines, that deep mechanical heartbeat that sailors sleep to, the sound that tells them they are safe, that the machine is working, that civilization is still holding back the water. But beneath that sound, there was another presence, silent, watching. The German U-boat U-172 had been tracking the Benlomond. It was a predator made of steel and oil, slipping through the cold currents, calculating the geometry of death. The commander looked through the periscope and saw a target moving at a sluggish 11 knots. He didn't see the men on board. He didn't see the 53 souls earning their wages, drinking their tea, thinking of home. He saw a silhouette. He saw tonnage. At 11:30 in the morning, the torpedo left the tube. It traveled for less than a minute, a white streak under the surface, a scar appearing on the blue water. When it hit, the world ended. The explosion didn't just break the ship, it erased it. The torpedo struck the boiler room. The sound was a thunderclap that snapped steel beams like dry kindling. The Benlomond broke its back instantly. The lights died. The engines screamed and stopped. In the sudden, shocking silence that followed the roar, there was only the sound of rushing water, the Atlantic Ocean forcing its way into the vacuum where air and heat used to be. Men who were standing 1 second were gone the next, vaporized by steam or crushed by the collapsing bulkheads. The ship began to tilt, sliding backward, dragged down by the weight of its own iron. On the deck it was absolute chaos, but it was a slow-motion chaos, the kind where your mind refuses to accept what your eyes are seeing. Men were running, but there was nowhere to run. The lifeboats, the heavy wooden cutters designed to save them, were jammed in their davits, twisted by the explosion or unreachable as the deck slanted steeply toward the sky. Crewmen jumped. Some jumped too early, hitting the propellers or the debris. Some waited too long, paralyzed by the height, until the water came up to meet them. And amidst this apocalypse of steam and shouting, there was one man who did not panic, or perhaps he was so terrified that he moved with the cold precision of a sleepwalker. His name was Poon. He was 24 years old. He was a second steward. In the hierarchy of the ship, he was invisible. He washed the dishes. He made the beds. He served the officers. He was a Chinese sailor in a British fleet, a man who existed in the margins of the ship's log. He had signed on to the Benlament, not for glory, but for the war bonus. A few extra pounds a month to risk his life ferrying cargo across a war zone. When the torpedo hit, Lim was off duty. He grabbed a life jacket. He didn't run for the main lifeboats. He looked at the angle of the ship, the screaming men, the tangled ropes, and he made a calculation. The ship was dying too fast. The big boats were death traps. He climbed over the rail. He looked down into the black oil-slicked water churning below. He was not a strong swimmer. In fact, he could barely swim at all. To jump was suicide. To stay was suicide. He jumped. He hit the water and the cold seized him like a physical blow. The salt stung his eyes. The oil coated his throat. He kicked, thrashing against the suction of the sinking ship, that terrible hydraulic force that tries to pull everything down with it. He surfaced, gasping, choking on seawater and diesel fuel. The Ben Lomond was gone. In 2 minutes. That is all it took. 2 minutes for a fortress of steel to vanish. The ocean had swallowed it whole. Now there was only the debris field, a scar on the surface of the water. Broken crates, shattered wood, slick patches of oil, and the bobbing heads of the survivors, screaming for help in the vast, indifferent silence. Poon Lim grabbed a piece of wood. He held on. He watched the horizon. He waited for the rescue that the manual said would come. He waited for the other ships. He waited for the mercy of the Navy. But as the sun began to set on that first day, the screaming stopped. The heads bobbing in the water disappeared one by one. The cold took them. The exhaustion took them. The sharks took them. When the moon rose, casting a pale, sickly light over the Atlantic, Poon Lim realized the truth. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was a verdict. He was alone. We have to pause here and look at the man himself. We have to ask why. Why him? Why did the ocean spare the second steward when it took the captain? When it took the engineers and the gunners? Poon Lim was born on Hainan Island, off the coast of China. He was a man of the coast, but not a man of the sea. His father had sent him away to work, to send money home. In 1942, a Chinese steward on a British merchant ship was a piece of machinery. Necessary, functional, but replaceable. He slept in separate quarters. He ate separate food. He was paid a fraction of what the white sailors earned. He had spent his life learning how to be invisible, how to stand in a room and not be seen, how to survive by observing, by anticipating the needs of the officers before they even spoke. This invisibility had prepared him for the raft. While the officers on the bridge were shouting orders, trying to command the chaos, trying to impose their rank on a sinking ship, Lim had bypassed the hierarchy. He hadn't waited for permission to jump. He hadn't waited for an order to put on his life vest. He had learned through years of being ignored that no one was coming to save him. If he was going to live, he had to save himself. Drifting in the water, clinging to wreckage, he saw something. It wasn't a boat. It was a wooden donut, a Kali float. These were the bottom of the barrel in life-saving equipment. They weren't boats. They were rafts. A rigid oval of copper or steel tubing, wrapped in cork, covered in canvas with a slatted wooden floor suspended in the middle. They were designed to float off a sinking ship automatically. They had no hull, no engine, no rudder. They were just a platform to keep you out of the water. Lim kicked towards it. He hauled himself up over the cork rim, his clothes heavy with water and oil. He rolled onto the wooden slats and lay there, panting, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He was safe. For now. He sat up and looked around. The Kali float was small, roughly 8 feet long. To a man standing on the deck of a liner, it looked like a toy. To Poon Lim, sitting inside it, it looked like an island. But it was a cage. The water was freezing. The wind was picking up. And as the night deepened, the reality of his position settled in. He was sitting on a wooden grate, 6 inches above the surface of an ocean that was 3 miles deep. He waited for morning. Surely the U-boat had radioed the position. Surely the British Admiralty knew the ship was gone. Surely a destroyer would break the horizon at dawn, smoke pouring from its stacks, bringing blankets and tea. Dawn came. The sun rose, a burning red eye in the east. The horizon was a perfect, sharp line. Nothing, no smoke, no sails, no birds, just the endless rhythmic heaving of the blue water. And then the thirst began. It wasn't a dryness in the mouth, it was a panic in the cells. He had swallowed salt water. His body was already crying out for fresh fluid. Poon Lim looked at the raft. He realized then that he wasn't a passenger anymore. He was the captain of a vessel that wasn't going anywhere. He began to explore his world, this wooden oval. A Kali float contains storage lockers built into the sides, watertight compartments. Lim pried them open, his fingers trembling, stiff with cold. This was the moment of accounting, the arithmetic of survival. He found tins of biscuits, hardtack, dry, dense bricks of flour and water, baked until they were as hard as stone. He found chocolate, luxury in a tin. He found pemmican, a concentrated mixture of fat and protein. He found flares, a torch, and most importantly, he found water. 10 metal canisters, roughly 40 liters. It sounds like a lot. If you are at home with a tap that runs forever, 40 liters is nothing. It's a long shower. It's a week of cooking. But on the equator, under a sun that hammers down with the force of a physical weapon, the human body loses liters of water just by existing. You sweat. You breathe. The wind steals the moisture from your skin. Lim did the math. If he drank freely, he would be comfortable for a week, maybe 10 days, and then he would die. If he rationed, really rationed, he could stretch it. He looked at the water tins. He looked at the biscuits. He made a decision that likely saved his life in the first 24 hours. He closed the locker. He didn't eat. He didn't drink. He told himself that he still had moisture in his body from before the sinking. He would wait. He would test his own breaking point. This was the discipline of the steward, the discipline of the man who waits. The second night fell. The temperature dropped. On the open ocean, without cloud cover, the heat of the day vanishes instantly. Lim huddled in the bottom of the raft, wrapping himself in the canvas cover provided in the kit. The waves slapped against the cork sides. Slap, slap, slap. A metronome counting down the time. He thought of his family in Hainan. He thought of the war. He thought of the U-boat commander, sleeping in a warm bunk somewhere beneath him. He realized that anger was a waste of energy. Fear was a waste of water. He had to become something else. He had to become a machine. By day 3, the hunger was a sharp pain, a cramp that doubled him over. But the thirst was worse. The thirst was a voice in his head, screaming. He opened the first tin of water. He took a sip. He held the water in his mouth, letting it coat his tongue, his gums. He didn't swallow immediately. He let the sensation absorb. Then he swallowed. It was the sweetest thing he had ever tasted. He established a routine. 2 sips of water, 1 biscuit, morning and evening. He marked the days by tying knots in a piece of rope he found on the raft. 1 knot for each sunrise. Not 1, not 2, not 5. The days blurred. The sun rose, cooked him and set. The moon rose, froze him and set. The ocean has a way of erasing time. Without a clock, without a job, without other people, time stops being linear. It becomes circular. The raft became his entire universe. He knew every scratch in the paint. He knew the texture of the canvas. He knew the way the light hit the water at noon versus the way it hit at 3 o'clock. He began to talk to himself. At first it was just mumbling, checking the inventory aloud. 3 tins left, 2 biscuits. But then the silence of the ocean began to press in on him. It was a heavy physical weight. The silence wasn't just the absence of noise, it was the presence of nothingness. If he didn't speak, did he exist? If no one saw him, was he real? "I am Poon Lim," he said to the waves. "I am here." The waves didn't answer. He shouted it. "I am here." The sound of his own voice was thin, weak, swallowed instantly by the wind. But it was human. It was a claim. He realized he had to keep the man alive, not just the body. He had to maintain the architecture of his mind. He began to act out his old duties. In his head, and sometimes with his hands, he would set the table for the captain. He would fold the napkins. He would polish the silver. He imposed order on the chaos. But order cannot stop biology. By the second week, The supplies were dwindling. The biscuits were running low. The water, the precious, finite water, was disappearing. He looked at the ocean. It was full of life. He could see them. Schools of fish darting in the shadow of the raft, small crabs clinging to the floating seaweed, and the birds, terns, gulls. They would fly over him, white specks against the blue vault of the sky. Sometimes they would land on the rim of the raft, looking at him with black, bead-like eyes. They were curious. They had never seen a human before. They didn't know what a human was. To them, the raft was just a log and Lim was just a piece of driftwood. Lim looked at the bird. He was a civilized man. He cooked his food. He ate with chopsticks or a fork. He was not a savage, but he was starving. The hunger had changed from a cramp to a dull, hollow ache that permeated his bones. His muscles were consuming themselves. The tern landed on the canvas just 2 feet away from his head. It ruffled its feathers. It looked away. Lim froze. He stopped breathing. He became the wood. He became the canvas. Slowly, millisecond by millisecond, he moved his hand. The bird didn't move. It was the arrogance of nature, the belief that it was untouchable. Lim's hand was a claw. His skin was burned brown by the sun, his fingernails ragged. He lunged. It wasn't a graceful motion. It was a desperate, spasmodic grab. His fingers closed around the bird's leg. The bird screamed, a harsh, scratching sound. It flapped wildly, wings beating against Lim's face, pecking at his hands. Lim didn't let go. He couldn't let go. He pulled the bird down. He grabbed its neck. He twisted. The bird went limp, a bundle of warm feathers and hollow bones in his hand. He sat there for a moment, the dead bird in his lap. The violence of the act shocked him. He had killed, with his bare hands. But then the smell hit him. Not the smell of the feathers, but the smell of the blood beneath the skin. The metallic, rich scent of life. He didn't have a knife. He had made a rough tool out of a biscuit tin, jagged and dull. He cut into the bird. He didn't cook it. He couldn't. He lifted the raw, dripping meat to his mouth. The taste was shocking. It was gamey, salty, warm. It triggered a primitive reflex in his jaw. He chewed. He swallowed. And then he did something that marked the true end of the civilized world and the beginning of his new life. He drank the blood. He put his mouth to the bird's veins and he drank. It wasn't just food, it was water, it was fluid. It was salt and iron and vitality. As the warm liquid went down his throat, Poon Lim felt a surge of energy, a dark, primal electricity. He looked out at the ocean, his face smeared with blood, the feathers scattered around his feet. He was no longer the second steward of the Benlomond. He was no longer a victim of the German Navy. He was a predator. The ocean had tried to starve him. It had tried to erase him. But now, he had taken a piece of the ocean and made it part of himself. He tossed the bones into the water. He wiped his mouth. He was ready for the long haul. But the ocean was watching too, and the blood in the water was sending a signal. Deep below the raft, in the twilight zone of the sea, shadows began to turn. The sharks had smelled the dinner bell. Poon Lim had survived the sinking. He had survived the thirst. He had survived the hunger. Now he would have to survive the monsters. Survival is not a moment of adrenaline. We like to think it is. We like to imagine the desperate jump, the fight with the beast, the sudden stroke of luck. But real survival, long-term survival, is boring. It is tedious. It is an act of administration. Poon Lim realized this as the first week bled into the second. The adrenaline of the sinking had faded, leaving behind a dull, grinding reality. If he was going to live, he couldn't just float. He had to build a life. He looked at his world. It was 8 feet long. It was made of wood, cork, and canvas. This was his house, his church, his hunting ground, and his toilet. He had to organize it. He began to impose a schedule on the void. Morning was for maintenance. He checked the lashings on the raft. The salt water was corrosive, eating away at the hemp ropes. He tightened knots. He shifted the wooden slats to keep them from warping. Midday was for shelter. The sun was a hammer. He used the canvas cover of the raft not as a blanket, but as a roof, rigging it up with the remnants of a boat hook to create a small, oscillating patch of shade. He learned to move with the shadow. As the sun arced across the sky, Lim rotated his body, chasing the darkness, keeping his skin out of the ultraviolet radiation that would blister him alive. Evening was for inventory. He counted the biscuits again. He shook the water tins. He calculated the weight. It was a world the size of a door, but within that rectangle, he was the governor. But a governor needs resources, and the most precious resource, the one that ruled his every waking thought, was water. The ocean is a cruel paradox. You are surrounded by water, suspended in it, soaked by it. But it is water you cannot touch. To drink seawater is to accelerate death. The salt draws the moisture out of your cells, shrinking the brain, causing hallucinations, organ failure, and madness. Lim watched the sky. He watched the clouds form towers of white cumulus in the afternoon heat. He saw rain sheets falling on the horizon, dark grey curtains that never reached him. And then it happened. The air pressure dropped, the wind shifted, smelling of ozone and wet earth, a scent that shouldn't exist in the middle of the Atlantic. The sky turned a bruised purple, a squall. For a sailor on a ship, a squall is a nuisance. For Poon Lim, it was a miracle. He scrambled to prepare. He took the canvas cover, his roof, and turned it upside down. He fashioned it into a basin, holding the corners, creating a depression in the center. The first drops hit the canvas like bullets. They were fat, cold, and heavy. He didn't drink immediately. He let the rain wash the salt crust off the canvas. He knew that the first liter would be brackish, contaminated by the sea spray that had dried on the fabric. He waited. The rain fell harder, a roaring hiss that drowned out the sound of the waves. Then he began to collect. He funneled the water from the canvas into his empty pemmican tins. He filled his water tank. He filled everything that could hold liquid. Only then did he drink. He lay on his back, mouth open, letting the rain hit the back of his throat. It was cold. It tasted of the atmosphere, of dust from high altitudes, of pure distilled life. He drank until his stomach hurt. He drank until he could feel the hydration moving into his fingertips, but the storm was moving fast. These tropical squalls are violent and brief. The grey curtain passed over him, moving west. The sun broke through again, instantly hot, instantly drying the deck. Lim looked at his stockpile. He had captured perhaps a few gallons. It wasn't enough to solve the problem, but it was enough to reset the clock. He had bought another week, but water is only half the equation. The biscuits were gone, the pemmican was gone, the chocolate was a memory. His body was beginning to consume itself. This is a physiological process called ketosis, and then later autophagy. The body, lacking fuel, begins to harvest energy from its own tissues. First the fat reserves, then the muscle. Lim could feel it happening. His ribs were pushing against his skin. His arms were becoming stringy. He was eating himself alive. He needed protein. He looked at the water. It was teeming with fish. Dorados, triggerfish, small sharks. They followed the raft because the raft attracted barnacles, and the barnacles attracted small fish, and the small fish attracted the predators. The raft had become its own ecosystem. He had no fishing rod, no net, no spear. He had a flashlight. It was a standard issue torch from the survival locker. He took it apart. He removed the spring from the bottom, a small coiled piece of steel. With the patience of a prisoner digging a tunnel, he began to work on the spring. He used the hard edge of the water tin as a hammer. He pounded the steel against the wood. He bent it, he uncoiled it. He spent hours grinding the tip against the rough cork of the raft's rim, sharpening it until it could pierce skin. He unraveled a piece of hemp rope, separating the thick fibers into thinner threads, braiding them together to make a fishing line. He had a hook, he had a line, but he had no bait. He used a piece of biscuit paste. It dissolved instantly. He used a barnacle he scraped off the underside of the raft. He dropped the line. He waited. Fishing is usually a pastime of leisure. For Lim, it was a high-stakes interrogation of the sea. Every minute without a bite was a minute of calorie loss. A tug. The line went taut. The hemp cut into his fingers. He didn't yank. He knew the hook had no barb. If he pulled too hard, the fish would slip off. He had to be gentle. He had to woo the fish onto the raft. He pulled hand over hand, slow, steady. A flash of silver broke the surface. A small fish, maybe 6 inches long. Lim swung it aboard. It flopped on the wooden slats, slippery and frantic. He pounced on it. He didn't have a knife, so he used the edge of the biscuit tin. He gutted it. He found a smaller fish inside the stomach of the fish he had caught. A matryoshka doll of survival. He ate the meat raw. It was sweet, firm. But he didn't stop at the meat. He ate the eyes. He ate the liver. He sucked the spinal fluid from the bones. He saved the intestines. Not for food, but for the next catch. He had cracked the code. He was no longer a passive victim waiting for rescue. He was a hunter. But in the ocean, when you become a hunter, you also become a target. The blood from the fish, the vibrations of the struggle. It drew the landlords of the ocean, sharks. They were always there, circling deep in the indigo gloom. But now they came to the surface. To a man in a boat, a shark is a curiosity. To a man on a raft, a shark is a peer. They were eye level with him. He could see the scratches on their skin, the parasites clinging to their gills, the cold, flat intelligence of their eyes. They bumped the raft. Thump. The wood shuddered. They were testing him. Was this wood? Was this meat? Was it weak? Lim watched them. He saw how they moved. He saw the way they turned before they bit. Most men would have been paralyzed by terror. But Poon Lim was past terror. He was in a place of cold, necessary logic. The fish were small. They weren't enough. The sharks were hundreds of pounds of meat. He decided to catch one. It sounds insane. A man weighing less than 120 pounds on a rotting wooden platform deciding to engage a killing machine. He braided a thicker line. He took the largest hook he could fashion from the nails of the raft. He used the head of a fish as bait. He threw the line out. A shark took it. Not a great white, but a small reef shark, perhaps 4 feet long. The line snapped tight. The raft spun. Lim held on. He wrapped the rope around his hands, the hemp burning his palms. He wasn't reeling the shark in. He was fighting it. He pulled it closer. The shark thrashed, its tail slapping the water like a gunshot. He got its head to the edge of the raft. He waited for the mouth to open. He jammed the water tin, his makeshift hammer, down. He hauled the beast onto the slats. It was chaos. A 4-foot shark on a small raft is a chainsaw with fins. It snapped its jaws, thrashing, trying to get back to the water. Lim jumped on it. He pinned it with his body weight. He hit it again and again. When it finally stopped moving, he sat back, covered in slime and blood. He cut it open. He ate the liver first. He didn't know the science. That shark liver is rich in vitamins. But his body knew. He felt the rush of nutrients. He cut strips of the meat and hung them on the fishing line to dry in the sun. He was making jerky. He looked at the fins. In his culture, these were a delicacy. Here they were just cartilage. He had done the impossible. He had turned the monster into a pantry. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into a month. Poon Lim was changing. If you had seen him then, you wouldn't have recognized the second steward. The soft lines of his face were gone, replaced by the sharp angles of a skull draped in leather. His skin was burnt a deep mahogany black. His hair was long, matted with salt. His fingernails were claws. He had stopped shivering. His metabolism had slowed down, entering a state of hibernation. He moved slowly. He blinked slowly. His mind was changing too. He stopped dreaming of banquets. He stopped dreaming of his bunk on the Benlomond. He dreamed of rain. He dreamed of fish. He was becoming part of the ocean. The boundary between the man and the environment was dissolving. He knew when a storm was coming by the pressure in his ears. He knew the time of day by the temperature of the wind. He was adapting. He was surviving. And then the test came, the cruelest test of all. It was morning. The sea was calm. He heard a sound, a low thrumming. It wasn't the wind. It was rhythmic, mechanical. He stood up, balancing on the swaying raft. A ship, a freighter. It was on the horizon, but it was coming closer. He could see the smoke. He could see the bridge. Hope, which he had buried deep inside him, exploded. He screamed, "Here! I am here!" He grabbed his shirt. He waved it. He grabbed the last flare he had saved. He struck it. Red smoke hissed into the sky, a brilliant, artificial cloud against the blue. The ship kept coming. It was getting larger. He could see figures on the deck. He could see the white foam of the bow wave. They had to see him. He was a red mark on a blue canvas. He prepared himself. He thought about what he would say. He thought about the taste of tea. The ship turned. It didn't turn toward him. It turned away. It changed course, widening the gap. Lim waved harder. "Don't go! Please, don't go!" But the ship didn't stop. It didn't slow down. The thrumming of the engine faded. The smoke trailed off. Why? Perhaps they thought he was a decoy. U-boats often used life rafts with dummies to lure merchant ships into slowing down, to make them easy targets. Perhaps they were American, and he looked Japanese in the distance. Perhaps they just didn't see him. It didn't matter. The why didn't matter. The ship grew smaller. The hope grew colder. Poon Lim stood there until the ship was just a smudge, and then nothing. He sat down. He looked at his dried shark meat. He looked at his water tin. The silence rushed back in, louder than before. He realized then that the world of men had rejected him. Civilization had passed him by. He was not going to be rescued. If he was going to live, he would have to do it alone. He lay down on the slats. He didn't cry. He didn't have the water to spare for tears. He closed his eyes, and he began to plan for the next 100 days. There is a specific kind of danger that comes from hope. We are taught that hope is a virtue, a light in the dark. But in the middle of the Atlantic, after 70 days of drifting, hope is a liability. It is a calorie burner. It spikes the heart rate. It keeps the eyes scanning the horizon when they should be resting. And when it is crushed, the crash that follows is more lethal than thirst. After the freighter disappeared over the rim of the world, Poon Lim made a conscious choice. He decided to kill the hope. He stopped scanning the horizon. He stopped looking for smoke. He realized that waiting for rescue was a form of dying. If he spent his days waiting for a ship, he was merely a victim passing time. But if he accepted that this raft was his home, that this ocean was his country, then he could live. He turned his attention inward. He began to plan, not for tomorrow, but for next month. He started thinking about the seasons of the ocean. This shift in mindset marked the beginning of the most dangerous phase, the psychological siege. The body can survive starvation for a long time. The liver processes fat. The muscles atrophy to feed the brain. But the mind? The mind cannot feed on itself forever. It needs friction. It needs other minds. In a sensory deprivation tank, the human brain begins to hallucinate within hours. It invents stimuli to verify that it is still awake. Poon Lim had been alone for 3 months. The silence of the ocean was no longer quiet. It was loud. It roared with the absence of human speech. To fight it, Lim began to populate the raft. He didn't just talk to himself. He held court. He summoned his father from Hainan. He spoke to him in Cantonese, explaining why the money hadn't arrived, explaining the war. He could hear his father's voice in the creak of the wood. He summoned the captain of the Ben Lomond. He had arguments with him about the quality of the tea. He reenacted entire shifts of duty, miming the motions of serving dinner, placing invisible plates on the wet canvas, pouring invisible wine. To an observer, he would have looked insane. A skeletal figure, burned black by the sun, gesturing wildly to the empty air, laughing at jokes no one told. But this was not madness. It was a defense mechanism. It was the brain building a firewall against the void. He was exercising his language centers, his memory, his social cognition. He was keeping the software running so that the hardware wouldn't crash. But while his mind was fighting to stay intact, the physical world was rotting beneath him. A Kali float is not designed for a voyage. It is designed for a few days of emergency use. It is made of cork and canvas and wood, organic materials. The ocean is a universal solvent. It dissolves everything eventually. By the 90th day, the raft was dying. The canvas covering the cork ring was disintegrating. UV radiation had made it brittle, and the salt water had turned it to mush. It peeled away in strips, revealing the cork underneath. The cork itself was becoming waterlogged. The raft sat lower in the water. In the beginning, Lim had been 6 inches above the sea. Now the waves washed over the slats constantly. He was sleeping in a puddle. And the smell. The raft smelled of decay. Barnacles had encrusted the underside. heavy and sharp as concrete. Seaweed trailed from the ropes, rotting in the sun. The fish guts, the shark blood, the bird droppings, it had all soaked into the wood. The raft was becoming part of the biological cycle of the ocean. It was no longer a machine, it was a reef. Lim spent hours scraping the barnacles off the bottom. It was backbreaking work, hanging over the side, hacking at the hard shells with his biscuit tin. He had to do it. The weight was dragging him down. If the raft became too heavy, it would lose buoyancy. It would simply slip beneath the surface while he slept. He was fighting a war of attrition against entropy, and he was losing. Then the weather turned. The Atlantic is not a uniform body of water. It has moods, it has seasons. Lim had survived the doldrums, the flat, hot calm. Now he was entering the storm belt. The sky turned a bruised greenish-black. The pressure dropped so fast his ears popped. The birds, his constant companions and food source, vanished. They knew what was coming. The wind didn't build up. It arrived all at once. A wall of air moving at 60 miles an hour. The ocean transformed. The rhythmic swells were replaced by chaotic, confused seas. Waves the size of houses rose up, not rolling, but colliding. Lim knew he couldn't steer, he couldn't hide. He took his hemp rope. He tied one end to the wooden grating and the other around his waist. He lay flat on the slats, pressing his body as low as possible, gripping the decaying cork with his hands and feet. The first wave hit the raft like a car crash. The float went vertical. For a second, Lim was hanging in the air looking down at the boiling foam. Then the raft slammed down, burying him in water. He held his breath. He clung to the wood. He surfaced, gasping, only to be hit again. This went on for hours, or maybe days. In a storm, time ceases to exist. There is only the interval between waves. His supplies were lashed down. But the violence of the water was tearing the lashings apart. He saw his water tin, the one with the precious rainwater, break loose. It slid across the slats. He lunged for it, but the raft bucked, throwing him back. The tin tumbled into the black water and was gone. His fish jerky, his dried shark meat washed away. When the wind finally died down and the sea settled back into a heavy, rolling swell, Poon Lim was still alive. But he was back to zero. He was bruised, bleeding from where the barnacles had cut his skin. He had lost his water. He had lost his food. The raft was a wreck, half submerged, groaning with every movement. He lay there, exhausted. He didn't have the energy to curse. He didn't have the energy to pray. He simply existed. But the storm had done something else. It had moved him. The currents in the ocean are like rivers. They flow with purpose. For months, Lim had been circling in the gyres, trapped in the middle of nowhere. The storm had pushed him out of the loop. A few days after the storm, Lim noticed something. The water. For 100 days, the water had been a deep, crystalline blue. The blue of extreme depth. The blue of a desert. Now, the water was changing. It was becoming greener. A pale, milky jade. He looked closer. There were particles in it. Silt. Dust. He looked at the sky. The birds were back. But they weren't the albatrosses or the terns of the high seas. These were frigate birds, coastal birds. He saw a piece of driftwood floating past. Not wreckage, but a branch. A tree branch with green leaves still attached. He stared at it. Green leaves meant land. It meant the branch hadn't been in the water for long. Poon Lim didn't know navigation. He didn't know that the Amazon River is so massive, so powerful, that it pushes fresh water nearly 100 miles out into the Atlantic. He didn't know he was drifting into the mouth of the greatest river system on Earth. He just knew the color had changed. He dipped his finger in the water and tasted it. It was still salty, but less so. It was brackish. The ocean was diluting. Hope, that dangerous thing he had tried to kill, began to stir again. But this time, it was different. It wasn't the frantic hope of a man waving at a ship. It was the quiet, terrifying hope of a man who sees the end of the endurance test. On the morning of the 133rd day, he saw the line, a thin purple smudge on the horizon. It wasn't a cloud, it didn't move. Land. But the current was tricky here. It pushed him toward the land, then pulled him back. The tide was fighting the river. He watched the land all day. He saw the details emerge, the tops of trees, the white line of a beach, and then he saw the sail, a small boat, not a steel freighter, but a wooden fishing vessel with a triangular sail. It was cutting across the choppy water, heading his way. Lim stood up. His legs were atrophied, his knees locked. He had to hold onto the boat hook to stay upright. He didn't wave his shirt this time. He didn't have a shirt. He was naked, his skin like leather, his hair a mane of salt and grease. He raised his hand, a simple, human gesture. The boat approached. It slowed down. There were 3 men on board. They were dark-skinned, weathered. They wore straw hats. They looked at the raft. They looked at the man. They stopped. They didn't cheer. They didn't rush forward. They drifted, keeping a safe distance. Lim could see the fear in their eyes. To them, he was not a survivor. He was a monster. A skeleton standing on a rotting pile of debris, surrounded by shark fins covered in blood and salt. He looked like a demon that the sea had vomited up. Lim tried to speak. His voice was a croak, unused to projecting. "Save," he whispered, then louder. "Save me." He pointed to his mouth. "Water." The fishermen spoke to each other in Portuguese. Lim didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. They were debating. Was he dangerous? Was he a ghost? Was this a trap? In the war, German submarines sometimes used tricks, but no submarine commander looked like this. One of the men, the oldest one, stood up. He looked Lim in the eye. He saw the humanity beneath the ruin. He picked up a coil of rope. He swung it. The rope flew through the air, uncoiling like a snake. It landed across the Kali float with a heavy, wet slap. Lim stared at it. That rope was the umbilical cord back to the world. It was the connection to gravity, to society, to laws, to solid ground. He reached down. His hands, shaped into claws by months of gripping the raft, struggled to close around the hemp. He held it. He looked at the fishermen and nodded. They engaged their engine. The rope went taut. The Kali float, the faithful, rotting wooden donut that had held him for 133 days, lurched forward. It was over. But as the raft began to move, cutting through the green water toward the coast of Brazil, Poon Lim felt a strange, cold sensation in his chest. He was leaving the ocean. He was going back to the land of men. But he realized, with a sudden sharp clarity, that he wasn't the same man who had left it. The Poon Lim who had served tea on the Ben Lomond was dead. He had died in the water. The man holding the rope was someone else entirely, a creature made of salt and survival. And as the coast grew closer, he wondered if he would ever really be able to leave the raft behind. The rope tightened. The engine of the fishing boat coughed a thick black cloud of diesel smoke into the air, and for the first time in 133 days, Poon Lim moved faster than the current. He was being towed. He was sitting in the back of the small Brazilian vessel, wrapped in a rough wool blanket that smelled of engine oil and tobacco. The sensation was overwhelming. Not the relief, but the vibration. The boat had a heartbeat, a mechanical, rhythmic thumping of pistons that vibrated through the wooden hull and into his spine. After months of the fluid, organic motion of the waves, the machine felt aggressive. It felt angry. He looked back. Trailing behind them on the tow rope was the Kali float. It looked pathetic. From this new vantage point, looking down at it, he saw what he had been living in. It was a wreck. The canvas was shredded, flapping in the wind like dead skin. The cork was waterlogged, barely breaking the surface. It didn't look like a vessel. It looked like a coffin that had refused to sink. He watched it for a long time. That rotting circle of wood had been his entire universe. It had been his mother and his father. It had fed him and tried to kill him. Leaving it felt like an amputation. The fishermen offered him food. They were simple men, weathered by the equatorial sun. They handed him a plate of beans and manioc flour. Lim looked at the food. His mind recognized it. Beans, starch, sustenance. But his body recoiled. His stomach had shrunk to the size of a tennis ball. His digestive system had gone dormant. He took a spoonful. He tried to swallow. His throat seized. His body rejected the texture. He retched, dry and painful. The fisherman patted his back. murmuring in Portuguese. They didn't understand the biology of starvation. They didn't know that you cannot just pour fuel into a broken engine. They offered him water. This he could take. He drank, and for the first time he didn't have to count the swallows. He didn't have to stop. The journey to the port of Belém took 3 days. 3 days of sitting on a hard bench, listening to the men talk, watching the coastline thicken. The green smudge became a wall of jungle. The water turned brown, heavy with the silt of the Amazon. He didn't sleep. He was afraid that if he closed his eyes, he would wake up back on the slats with the shark fins circling. He needed to keep his eyes open to anchor himself in this new reality. When they finally entered the harbour of Belém, the world assaulted him. Sound. That was the first shock. The ocean is loud, but it is a white noise. Wind, wave, hiss. The harbour was a cacophony. Ship horns, shouting stevedores, clanking chains, grinding gears, barking dogs. It was a sonic weapon. Lim covered his ears. It was too much information. The boat docked. A crowd began to gather. News travels fast in a port city, and the fisherman had been signalling. A survivor. A man from the sea. People pressed against the edge of the dock. Faces. Hundreds of them. Lim looked at them, and he felt a strange, detached horror. They were so loud. They were so fast. They moved with a frantic energy that made him dizzy. He tried to stand up to greet them. He grabbed the gunwale of the boat and pushed. His legs didn't work. He had spent 4 months crouching, sitting, or lying down. His muscles had atrophied. His joints had calcified. When he tried to put weight on his feet, his knees buckled. He collapsed onto the deck. Gay murmur went through the crowd. They weren't looking at a hero. They were looking at a biological curiosity. A man who had forgotten how to walk. He was carried off the boat on a stretcher. He was lifted up over the gap between the water and the land and set down on the concrete. The ground was hard. It didn't sway. It didn't breathe. It was solid, immovable, and dead. Poon Lim lay on the stretcher, gripping the sides, feeling the nausea of vertigo. The world had stopped moving, and his inner ear couldn't handle the stability. He was taken to the hospital in Belém. The transition from the wild to the clinical is a violent one. They stripped off his rags, the remnants of the uniform he had worn since the torpedo struck. They cut away the canvas patches he had tied to his skin. They washed him. The water was hot. It stung his salt-cured skin. The soap smelled chemical, artificial. They put him in a bed, a real bed, with white sheets. Lim lay in the center of the mattress. It was too soft. He felt like he was sinking into it, suffocating in the cotton. He asked the nurses, in broken English and sign language, to put him on the floor. The floor was hard. The floor made sense, but they insisted. Rest, senor, rest. Doctors came. They were men of science, men of measurements. They looked at the chart. They looked at the man. They didn't believe him. It was impossible, they said. No human being can survive 133 days on a raft. The previous record was barely a month. Without fresh water? Without a survival kit? Impossible. They measured his weight. He had lost 20 pounds. It doesn't sound like much, but Poon Lim was a small man to begin with. What was missing was the muscle. His body had metabolized his own biceps, his thighs, his chest. He was a walking skeleton wrapped in dark, leathery skin. They checked his blood. They checked his skin. They asked him questions. Where is the ship? What was the date? How did you catch the sharks? Lim answered them. He spoke quietly, his voice raspy. He told them about the bird blood. He told them about the nail he used as a hook. He told them about the storm. He spoke with the flat, unemotional precision of a witness who has seen too much. He didn't brag. He didn't cry. He just reported the facts. The British consul arrived. He was a bureaucrat, a man of files and telegrams. He brought the shipping logs. He checked the date of the SS Benlemon's sinking, November 23rd, 1942. He checked the date of the rescue, April 5th, 1943. He did the math on a piece of paper. He did it twice. He looked at Lim. He looked at the paper. 133 days. The consul sent a telegram to London. The message was short, but it would ripple through the Admiralty and eventually the world. Second Steward Poon Lim found alive. sole survivor, 133 days at sea. And then the machine turned on. If the ocean was a monster of indifference, the press was a monster of attention. They came into the hospital room. Flashbulbs popped, exploding like little magnesium grenades, blinding him. Reporters shouted questions. "Smile, Mr. Lim, hold up your hand. Tell us about the shark." They wanted a story. They wanted a miracle. The war was grinding on. Europe was burning. The Atlantic was a graveyard. The public was tired of death lists. They needed a resurrection. And Poon Lim was the perfect resurrection. He was paraded. As soon as he could stand, as soon as he could wear a suit, he was moved. He was taken to the United Kingdom. King George VI wanted to see him. The journey to England was on a ship, a passenger liner. He was given a cabin. He was given a seat at the captain's table. Dinner was served. Roast beef, potatoes, gravy, wine. Lim sat at the table, surrounded by officers in crisp white uniforms. The silverware gleamed under the electric lights. The conversation was polite. He looked at the plate, he looked at the knife, he picked it up. It felt light, flimsy. He cut the meat. He put it in his mouth. It tasted like nothing. It was soft. It required no effort. He looked around the table. The men were laughing, eating, complaining about the weather. They didn't know. They didn't know that just below them, through a few inches of steel, was the dark, cold water. They didn't know that the shark was waiting. They didn't know that their civilization was a thin veneer over the abyss. He felt a sudden, violent urge to grab the fish off the platter and tear it apart with his hands, to feel the snap of the spine, to taste the blood. He put his fork down. He smiled a polite steward smile. "It is delicious," he said. He was acting. He had survived the ocean by becoming a savage, and now he had to survive civilization by becoming a gentleman. When he arrived in London, the contrast was even starker. London was a city at war. Bombed-out buildings, rationing, searchlights sweeping the sky. But for Poon Lim, he was a celebrity. The newspapers called him the unsinkable Chinese. They wrote cartoons about him. They framed his survival as a triumph of British grit, ignoring, conveniently, that he wasn't British, and that the British system had left him to die. He stood in front of cameras. He shook hands with admirals who had never missed a meal in their lives. They asked him for his secret. "How did you do it, Mr. Lim? Willpower? Faith?" They wanted a spiritual answer. They wanted to hear that he had prayed, that he had thought of the king, that he had a noble spirit. Lim looked at them. How could he explain the mechanics of drinking bird blood? How could he explain the math of urine and rain? How could he explain that he didn't survive because he was brave, but because he was stubborn? "I didn't want to die," he told them. "I hope no one has to ever go through that again." It was a simple answer, but it hid a deeper truth. He was beginning to realize that the world didn't want to know the real story. They didn't want to know about the madness. They didn't want to hear about the conversations with the ghosts. They didn't want to know about the taste of raw liver. They wanted a fairy tale. They wanted Robinson Crusoe. So he gave it to them. He became the polite, humble survivor. He accepted the applause. But at night, in the hotel room in London, with the blackout curtains drawn, he couldn't sleep. The bed was too soft. The air was too still. He would lie on the floor next to the radiator. He would close his eyes and listen. He could still hear it. The slap of the water against the cork, the creak of the wood, the hiss of the wind. The ocean hadn't let him go. It was still there, in the back of his mind, waiting. And there was something else, something harder to define. He was being celebrated, yes, but he was also being handled. The British Navy was very interested in him, not just as a hero, but as a data point. They realized that their manuals were wrong. They realized that their survival kits were inadequate. They realized that a Chinese steward with no training had figured out things that their top scientists had missed. They wanted his knowledge. They wanted to extract the data from his trauma. And there was the matter of the medal. The king was going to award him the British Empire Medal. It was a high honor. But in the corridors of power, in the whispered meetings at the Admiralty, there was a hesitation. He was Chinese. He was Merchant Marine, not Royal Navy. Technically, he shouldn't get the highest honors. Those were for officers. Those were for white men. There was a debate. Should we give him the George Cross? No, that's too much. The BEM is enough. Lim didn't hear these conversations, but he felt them. He felt the subtle barrier that still existed. He had crossed the ocean, but he hadn't crossed the class line. He hadn't crossed the race line. He was the unsinkable Chinese. A curiosity, a mascot. He began to feel a different kind of isolation. On the raft he was alone, but he was free. He was the master of his domain. Here, in the heart of the empire, surrounded by millions of people, he was a prop. He walked the streets of London. He saw the faces of the people. They looked tired. They looked worried. He wanted to shake them. He wanted to scream at them. You have water. You have food. You have solid ground. Why are you unhappy? But he stayed silent. He had learned the power of silence on the raft. He realized that he had returned to the world, but he didn't belong to it anymore. He was a traveler from a different dimension, and as the war dragged on and the headlines faded, Poon Lim faced the hardest part of his journey. The ocean was gone. The sharks were gone. Now he had to survive the peace.